Welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, and we're joined today by Gordon Penfold of Turnaround Pastors. Gordon was the immediate past president at the Great Commission Research Network and has been working in church renewal and revitalization for the better part of the last decade. He's got a new book out, Restart Churches, a proven strategy to restore vibrant ministry in your church, and we're talking about that today. We're so excited to be offering this Renewal Voice episode of the podcast where we interview people who are being thoughtful about the renewal and revitalization of the church. So come along as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. All right, welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. We have in the not in the studio. We are social distancing. Gordon's in his home studio. I'm in mine. But we've got Gordon Penfold with us of Turnaround Pastors. Gordon, how are you doing today, brother?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, Gordon, where are you located in the country?
We live in Eaton, Colorado, which is about 60 miles north of Denver, between Denver and Cheyenne.
All right. And do you do? I know previous to this season of social distancing and whatnot, you were doing a lot of traveling, conferences, teaching, that sort of thing. What are you doing in this particular moment?
Well, I started doing online training back in 2013, 2014. So this was just a natural continuation of that. I've been doing a lot of that. I prefer face to face, but we're face to face today, just not quite as close. You're 3 feet from your screen. I'm 3 feet from my screen. We're socially distanced.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, let's get into this, Gordon. How did your life and ministry intersect with this broader conversation about church renewal and church revitalization? How did you begin to get into this kind of work in your life?
That's a great question. As a young pastor, I would meet pastors regularly, and I would look at them and think, I think this pastor is going to probably do really well, but the other guy, I'm thinking maybe not going to do so well. But I never could figure out what made the difference. I have a friend who turned around 2 churches, became a denominational leader, and people would ask him, "How did you do it?" He said, "I don't know." So when I 30 years after I went to seminary, I went back to school. I went to Talbot to get my Doctor of Ministries degree in growing and multiplying the church in North America. And what I did was, for my dissertation, I've been thinking about a lot of things. I thought, are there identifying traits or characteristics of revitalization pastors that are not found in maintenance pastors or pastors that are in churches that are plateaued or declining? So when I did my research, found I had 8 hypotheses, and 4 of them proved to be true.
Okay.
So I began to discover what it is that makes these revitalization leaders tick. And then I gave a presentation at the Great Commission Research Network in 2011. Aubrey Malfers was there, and he began to ply me with questions. And 2 weeks later, he said, "Let's do a book together." So I said, "Let me think about it." Okay, that's about how long it took. So we wrote Revision, and that was a research-based book on revitalization.
All right. So in the ministry world, church planting is a really exciting place to be. The mission field, I mean, obviously there are places in the world that need the light of the gospel penetrating the darkness, that don't have it. Why is this kind of work in this field of both research and of training and education, this area of church revitalization and renewal, why is it important to you?
Well, when I was growing up, I grew up in a very dysfunctional church. There was no life there. I made a promise to God I would never go to church again, and then I was introduced to Christ as a freshman at Colorado State University. And I made a promise to God I would never go to church again. And the guy said, "Oh, you need to go to church with us." And they said, "And bring your Bible." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because we used them." And I thought, well, that's novel. So when I went to the church, I was taken by a church that was alive. And so 2 things happened. 1, Christ radically changed me. And 2, I was radically influenced by this church in a very positive way. And so I long to see that happen again. And in America, most of the churches are plateaued or declining. 80 to 85% are either stagnant or declining. and that's just a huge percentage. And so we long to see churches come alive
Mm.
and with a life-giving message of the gospel, transforming, seeing lives transformed, and seeing people just fully engaged as disciples of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So that kind of turns my crank.
Yeah, yeah. So how would you describe for our listeners what does it mean for a church to be stagnant or declining? Are we just talking about dollars in the coffers and butts in the seats? What does a stagnant or declining church look like to you?
Well, sometimes people want to use membership, but we've found the best measure is actual worship attendance. And there's always holes as to which system is the best. But if you look at worship attendance, and most churches worship attendance is either stagnant or is declining, and in some cases declining precipitously. So what we're saying is there's really not life there, or not much life there, and they're not giving the life-giving gospel to people so that they can be saved and be transformed. And so I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. And I think two important things for our listeners to know that go along with that. There you look around and you see some churches growing, but I think the research suggests that most churches are not growing by conversion and new life. Most churches are growing by transfer. And the other bit that I found interesting is that the churches per capita isn't keeping up. So it's not that there are so many churches and that's why churches are stagnant or declining. We actually have fewer Christian congregations per people in the country here in the United States than we did, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. So so there's this problem of church decline, church stagnation. Um, what do you see as some of the root causes of decline or stagnation in churches? Before we kind of get into the solution that your new book that we mentioned in the intro here, Restart Churches. Before we get into solutions, what do you see as some of those root causes for stagnation and decline?
Well, as we work with a lot of churches, and I particularly work with churches that become conflicted, and many plateaued and declining churches are conflicted because they're running out of money and they're running out of people, and they still have the structure for a large church, but they don't have the resources. So first and foremost, I think there's a loss of understanding of the mission. Why do we exist as a church? And then the vision. What are we supposed to do with what God has given us? So those are two things that I think really play into the decline. Also, I think in our research, what we've discovered is churches want to be led. They don't want to be they don't want to be driven, but they want to be led. And we find that many pastors are not good leaders. And
Hmm.
I've been trained in leadership. When I was in seminary, leadership was a dirty word. Um, I even taught it so for a while. Vision was not something that was a good thing. But when churches have no objective, they don't understand the Great Commission, or they've not embraced the Great Commission, nor do they have an idea of how to accomplish the Great Commission, they struggle.
Yeah, we often say that churches get stuck in an establishment mindset, kind of the assumption that, well, people will come here because that's what good people do. They come to church. Versus a missionary mindset. We are a tactical mission team to this community. So we need to have a clear vision for our mission. We need to be intentional with that mission. That faithfulness. There are folks in I travel mostly in reformed circles, reformed and evangelical circles, and there's a heavy emphasis on, well, we're just going to be faithful. Well, faithfulness also means that Jesus is gathering people and he does it through the proclamation of the gospel. If we're not doing that, how about that? Well, let's get into a piece of the solution. You have a new book out, Restart Churches. You wrote with Gary Taylor, a proven strategy to restore vibrant ministry in your church. And in it, you write that you write about the natural life cycle of churches and at which point different kinds of interventions are needed in a church. So, could you briefly distinguish for us from your perspective the difference between a church that needs revitalization, a church that needs to turn around, and a church that needs to restart?
Sure. Sure. In the natural life cycle, there's a birth of a church, the growth of a church, the maturity of the church, the decline of the church, and the death of the church. And so sometimes there needs to be different interventions at different stages of the church life cycle. And by the way, the life cycle is not a death sentence. I've pastored 3 churches who are all over 100 years old. And but what that means is they did have revitalization or turnaround at some point or another. It used to be a typical life cycle would be about 60 years without intervention. So I've pastored some churches that are significantly older than that. So as you look at the church growth curve or the life cycle curve, there's birth, there's growth, and then at maturity. Sometimes at maturity is when churches kind of begin to level out.
Mm-hmm.
And even church plants after about 15 years tend to level out. And at that point, it's a good time to revitalize. You start a new life cycle. You start a new uptick on the curve so that
Mm-hmm.
you don't continue to decline, to descend down the decline side. And then between maturity and decline, that's a great time to do turnaround. That's when at the top, you're starting a new life cycle. You're starting to go back uphill again. After you started down, then you kind of do a U-turn, and that would be a turnaround, which kind of fits, the parlance fits. But then when a church gets quite a ways down, on towards death, then that's the time to do a restart. And that's when you just kind of jumpstart or kickstart the process. And there are some steps that churches usually take in order for that to happen. And then after the death of a church, all you have left, the people are gone. There's a building there. I was driving through a community on Monday, and I was working with a church. And as I drove through town, I saw a beautiful old church building, red sandstone church building. It's now a restaurant or a museum. And many old churches that way. And again, the church is not the building. But when you see those buildings, you say, there was a death of a vision there. There was a loss of the mission there. So replant takes place after death, when nothing left except a building, and so a group moves in and they use the facilities, but there's no resources financially, there's no resources people. I mean, the church is dead,
Right.
and so that would be a replant. And there's a lot of that going on in the country today, where people are raising up a new church in an old location, but it's entirely new and separate from the existing church.
Right. So, so Matt, our mutual friend Matt Bowling often says that when the feeling in the room is we've arrived, and when the most important problem at the elder board meeting is, hey, this wall could use some new paint. That's that, like, we've leveled off. Okay, we need a new reinvigoration of our mission vision. So turnaround, we're starting to see some decline, but we still have a strong core. And then we get to restart. We have a core, but it's usually what, pretty small, pretty resource strapped. How would you describe a church that is prime for restart? Before we get into what is restarting, what's the kind of church that fits the description of we should restart?
Great question. Usually, as you look at churches, there's a lack of people in programs. There's also no energy. They're tired, they're worn out. Lack of people in programs. Often there's financial challenges. As we looked at our research, 60% of the churches said we're running out of people. 47% of the churches said we don't have enough money to operate. And usually money is the last thing to go. So that's not a good measure of should we turn around or not turn around, should we restart or not restart. And for many churches, it was either restart or close. That was the only option. And that was 42% of the churches that we looked at. In some churches, it's a loss of a key leader. It could be the loss of a key layperson. It could be the loss of a pastor. If there's been a church that's had a pastor who has had a long tenure and he dies suddenly or moves away or something happens, gets dementia, that has a drastic impact, especially on long tenured pastorates, because the church is so tied and identified with that local pastor. Sometimes it's denominational pressure. Worked with, I'm aware of one church, wrote about it in the book, where the church was going to build a gymnasium. They borrowed $1 million, I think it was $1.5 million from the denomination. It was going to cost $3.5 million. So they got partway into the building process and they couldn't finish. They couldn't pay the mortgage. They couldn't do anything. So the denomination said, you either join with Northview, or we're going to take over the building and we're going to recoup our loss by selling the property. And in that area, it's really difficult to get church property zoned for churches. So that would have been a loss of a key ministry place. So in that case, there was denominational pressure, and sometimes it's a changing community. First church I pastored, the community was changing, but the church didn't want to change. They wanted to ignore the realities around them. And eventually that church closed and reopened as a Hispanic church, and it's still doing well today.
Mm.
But that, in a sense, that was really almost a replant. And then a speaker, a consultant would come and say, listen, you're in big trouble. You're in deep weeds. You probably should restart. I met with a church just a few days ago, and I don't know, I'm not sure, but this may be an option for them. They're larger, but they're just absolutely stuck. And so when churches get so stuck that they don't know where to turn, restart is often a possibility.
Sure. So you described some churches that intentionally close. They distribute the resources. They sell their property to benefit missions or church planting. You describe those churches as legacy churches. What what has to be there if a church is going to restart? What has to be left if a church is going to restart? Let me ask the question this way: what kind of church should restart, and what kind of church should become a legacy church?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a very difficult one. One of my friends in North Carolina had a church that got down to 4 people, and their pastor left. And a lot of people would say, well, that should be a legacy church. But he worked with the church in the meantime. He coached the church, and then they brought in a really a revitalization leader, and that church in 6 months was running about 60.
Mm.
He anticipated it within a year and a half, they'd be running around 100. So in that case, there was still life there. There was still willingness. I think willingness is a huge piece. And if a church is not willing to do the hard things, then maybe they should close. I described one church in the book. I got a call from a friend of mine, and this church had 13 members. It was down in the Phoenix area. It was 100 years old. And so I talked to the chairman of the elders, who happened to be the only man, and he was the youngest of the church. He was 75. And a lot of other people had either moved to heaven or moved to near family, or moved to retirement homes. So as I talked to him, I said, I can come and do an assessment. And they had 3 staff members. They had a youth pastor, they had a visitation pastor, and a senior pastor with 13 members. So they had a facility in the middle of an industrial park. It was not a neighborhood church. It was in the middle of an industrial park. And they had about $700,000 in the bank, and they had a facility that was worth well over $1 million. And I said, in your case, I think the best thing you can do is have a celebration service, gather all the former members that you possibly can, have a celebration service, celebrate the goodness of God as he's used this church over the years. And they had made a massive impact for Christ over that 100-year period. And then close the church and distribute the assets, give your staff an adequate severance package, and then take the remaining funds and invest them in other church plants someplace else, or in missions or whatever, but invest it in ministry. So don't waste what the church has gathered over the years, but plow it back into the mission field, wherever that's going to be.
Yeah. Some people who listen to the podcast and know our ministry at Flourish would be surprised to know that one of the churches Matt pastored intentionally became a legacy church. They had funds, they even had people, but they had a significant shift in population. The people who lived in the community that went to the church had moved away for work. It was a fast-paced suburban community. The remainder of the group lived close to a new church plant, and so they said, "Look, we could do a lot with the resources from this property," and that's what they did. Yeah, I mean, they intentionally. I think you can be faithful to Jesus and become a legacy church, and you can be faithful to Jesus and restart. In the book, you write that restarting concentrates all the energy and changes at a specific point in time to jolt the church into restart. Sounds like restarting a car. What what do you mean? What is restart? What is a church restart?
So church has to stop and say, listen, we're not doing well. We're declining in membership and vitality. So let's just take a pause and let's look at things. And generally, although in the research we did 45, we looked at 45 churches. Only 7 or 8 of them actually stopped services for a while, but they just pause and they kind of look at themselves and they begin to retool. And even if they do close down for a while, in the meantime, they're working in the background. They may be taking on a new name if the church has a bad name in the neighborhood, and that often happens. They may just begin to rethink about mission, vision, and so on, and recapture what it is that the Lord wants. And then I worked with a church in Fort Collins, and their first Sunday was Resurrection Sunday this year. And lo and behold, it had to be virtual online because of
Mm.
COVID-19. And so now they're just beginning to get back to the point where they can reopen. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do. But they spent that time to say, we're not going to be the same church that we used to be. We're going to do things differently. Our leadership structure is going to change. We're not going to be stuck in the past, and so forth. And then at the appropriate time, in this case, it was on Resurrection Sunday, they popped the clutch and started services in an empty building because of COVID-19. But they've engaged a lot of people online.
Yeah.
And in this particular church, we said, what kind of people are you going to reach? And they said, well, we're pretty much rednecks, so we're probably going to reach rednecks. So they identified really who they were and how they could be most effective. So that's a good thing.
Sure, First Redneck Church of the Chevrolet. That's
Something like that. Yeah,
I can see people that go there. I want to talk more about you mentioned this one church and their restart in the middle of COVID. I'd actually like to talk a little bit about that, but before we do, um, it sounds to me like you're saying that restart is at the very least a mentality. Other forms of church renewal and revitalization don't stop the engine. They make adjustments midstream. But the mentality of restart is even if we don't cease public worship, we're going to pause programs, pause leadership, pause initiatives. We're going to pause, put everything on the table, reevaluate.
Yes.
No sacred cows. I know I've been involved in church conflicts where there was anger because old gospel tracts got thrown away off of a counter. I mean, everything in church is people are so personally invested in church things. It seems almost unimaginable to me that a congregation would really be willing to put everything on the table and pause. Um, what do you think? What do you think leads a group of people to be willing to do that? Is it desperation? What is it?
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, I put an appendice, one of the appendices in the book. It talks about the need for change. So first off, there has to be a recognition that we're in trouble. And then secondly, is there a willingness to change? And people have to get so desperate. John Cotter said that in order for change to take place, the first thing that has to happen is there must be a sense of urgency. And people sometimes have to wake up and smell the coffee, and the coffee doesn't smell good. And so we're going to have to not only change the coffee, we're going to have to change the percolator. We're going to have to change or the Keurig. I guess that would be modern. So yeah, there's just a recognition that man, we're in trouble if we don't do something, we're going to die. And we want the gospel to continue in our neighborhood with power. And so it takes a desperation before churches are willing to restart. It takes desperation to do a turnaround or even the revitalization at the top of the curve. So there has to be a sense of need. I think there has to be a sense of the Spirit of God working in the hearts of people, drawing them to recognize that uh, things are broken and they need to be fixed.
Yeah. So I don't want you to give away the farm here. The book is fantastic. Folks can get it through Church Smart Resources is the publisher. But could you give us, like, you say that church restarting is a process, and I love process language. It depersonalizes it. Process is good because it's adaptable to a given situation, but in the broad brushstrokes, what are the kind of, the headline bullet point steps in the process of restart?
Great question. Really, the big picture is three steps. There's preparation, there's transition, and there's launch. So there's preparation. We're broken. We need help. So here are the primary steps that churches normally take in that process. Again, of seeing the preparation and the transition and then the launch. So often there's a change in pastoral leadership. If a church is stuck for a long time, and I saw this working with a pastor in Georgia, and he'd been there a long time, tried to introduce change, and the church rebelled against him. So there was a change in pastoral leadership, not because he wanted it, but it took place. So there's often a change in pastoral leaderships. There's different sticking points in a church. It can be the pastor, it can be the leadership team, or it can be the congregation itself. So, but often there's a change in pastoral leadership. Ed Stetzer said in Comeback Churches, I believe it was, that 6 out of 7 churches that did revitalization changed pastors. And sometimes it's a change in the pastor himself. Sometimes it's a change in the pastor. You see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah,
Sometimes
yeah.
internal change, and that's difficult, but it can happen. It does happen. Often there's a change in church leadership when churches are stuck. You have to look at leadership. Everything does rise and fall on leadership, and in this case, we have leadership and a process to follow, which are really key. So then churches, many of them, if they had a bad reputation in the community, changed the name. You met Deb Roomer when we were at Exponential, and their church was known as the Church of the Old People. So they covered the sign for a couple months, and they put a new sign on, and it fit their ministry, Transformation Church, which is really what was going on the inside. So the name reflected what was going on the inside. So in their case, there was a new church name, and many churches do a new church name because there's a bad reputation in the community. And usually it's all followed by a new structure, a new constitution. I'm not talking about building structure, but there's a new structure. Sometimes it's a winning on purpose structure. John Edmund Kaiser, where the pastor leads and the board holds him accountable and so forth. But there's a new structure. The way of doing things is different. I look at church constitutions the way that I would look at a ship lying at anchor. You get the barnacles on the hull, and pretty soon you get enough barnacles and the ship can barely make headway. And that happens to a lot of churches. We're just barnacled over with traditions and those kinds of things. I define traditions as the living faith of those now dead, and traditionalism as the dead faith of those now living.
Yes, I like that quote.
And so that happens in a lot of churches where they're just stuck. So they have to redo things. They have to scrape the barnacles off the hull. And then without question, there's a new vision and a new strategy for accomplishing the ministry. And in many cases, there's even new or remodeled facilities. Change the name on the outside, the building looks different, and people come in, the signage is gone, new signage. It's just a saying, we are not who we used to be. And then some close for a time, and for churches that are really broken, closing for a time is it's essential, just to give time to retool. It's like a grand reopening at a grocery store or a department store or something. You close, and then people kind of get excited to come back and kick the tires and see what it's like. But if they come back with the same old, it's not going to work. And then this is an important thing, and I know you guys do coaching, so I'll give you a plug, but they acquire a coach or a mentor or an outside advisory person or a team. Often in these churches, there's not enough good leadership within the body, so they may get other churches to actually make up an elder team or a leadership team, a transition team, to help them through the process as they begin to raise up new leadership. So those are the primary, the primary things that take place.
So, so we've talked a little bit about that change in leadership. Gordon, what are I know that you've written about this in other places. One of the chapters of Restart Churches is dedicated to this, but then you've also written about the characteristics that are necessary for a leader to turn around a church. Without going into the whole of your corpus of writing on the issue, could you kind of highlight for us what are a couple of the key characteristics of a leader who's adept at leading change, revitalization, restart?
Oh, I think right off the top, two things. First, the pastor has to lead. And what we've discovered in our research is that the majority of pastors are not leaders. Uh, they need to lead, they need to execute a vision and a mission, and they're able to do that, and they're able to bring people along. And we also discovered that churches don't want to be driven, but they do want to be led. And the most effective pastors are more tell than suggest.
Okay.
But most pastors are more suggest. They'll say, "Well, what do you think?" And so they have a board meeting. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? And at the end of the day, they've not arrived at anything. They've just talked about what everybody thinks, but there's no consensus. There's no moving forward. And a revitalization leader, a restart pastor, will come in and say, "I've really been praying about this. This is the direction we need to go. This is what we need to do. What can we do to make it happen?" There's just a different mindset. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. It sounds like there 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 seem to be kind of three spheres or maybe buckets. There seem to be like three buckets that pastoral gifts and skills come in. One bucket is that teacher instructor bucket. One bucket is that pastoral care, shepherding, relational bucket, and one bucket is that leading, directing, guiding bucket. And what I hear you saying is that to do renewal and revitalization, you've got to have some skills in that leadership bucket, and not just if you're the visionary teaching pastor of a healthy, thriving church, and you've got some high level leaders on your elder board, it's okay if you don't have the best leadership skills because your role in that ministry is really a teaching role. But if you're at a turnaround situation, you need someone who's got something in that leadership bucket. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and even in the other churches, uh, when a pastor is just a teacher, a friend of mine is a denominational leader in North Carolina, and he's been there a long time. He's had 275 pastors or so that have come through his churches in that time. And he said that the pastors that are purely teachers, he said not a single one of their churches grew. And he said, when I go to their services, I want to take a piece of cardboard at the end of the service. I want to stand up at the back and say on the sign, "So what?"
Oh yeah.
Because the gift of teaching, you impart knowledge. The gift of exhortation, you impart knowledge and say, "No, this is what you need to do with it." And see, I think that's an essential for church transformation. And he said, out of all those churches that had pastors that were just teachers, not a single one of them grew. Not a single one.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in our other first research with Aubrey, we found two pastors who were not really good leaders, whose churches did well. But in those cases, the pastors had enough security. They were not insecure. They had enough security to allow someone else in the church to cast a vision, and then they implemented it. One guy was down here in Kansas, not too far from where I live. And he said, "Yeah, I'm not a visionary guy at all, but I have an elder in my church who is, and I'm good with that." But only 2 out of 146 pastors were in that case, in that
Mm-hmm.
situation. And there was another pastor who, I want to make sure we don't give the wrong impression. There was another pastor who served 2 churches, did not necessarily exhibit the quote unquote leadership skills, but his third church really took off. And so when Aubrey interviewed him, he said, "What happened?" He said, "I finally learned how to pastor." And in Mark chapter 1, verse 17, Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." So Jesus took fishers of fish and transformed them into fishers of men. And that's what leadership development is all about. And so for those that may not have the skills, it doesn't mean that you can't get there. For some, it's a natural. We found about 12% of the pastors were natural revitalization leaders, but pastors can grow. Uh, Peter became a fisher of men. James and John became fishers of men, and the Lord equips us to become fishers of men. I am not the man I used to be, and hopefully, I'm in another year or two, I can say I'm not the man I used to be because I've continued to grow and develop. So we can grow and develop in these skills, and that's why we do what we do in one sense when we train pastors. So, but pastors have to lead.
Yeah.
And there are exceptions, but they are rare.
Yeah. So, as we kind of come to the end of our time together, I'd love for you to kind of zoom back a minute from the specifics of a local congregation that is in acute need of restart to just congregations in general at this interesting moment in time. You and I are recording near the middle of June. This episode will air on the podcast in probably mid-July. And so I think most states are still going to be in some form of public health regulations. Uh, do you? I think that even churches that are healthy and thriving pre-COVID, pre-social distancing, are in some way, shape, or form like a restart church.
Oh, I can't imagine the book coming out at a better time. Honestly, we struggled to get it. It took us almost 3 years to get it written. And I was saying, boy, Lord, how come this is taking so long? Why doesn't this come together? Well, timing is everything.
Now, by the time this airs, a lot of churches will have restarted some version of in-person worship. There are places in the country where the public health issue is more acute, and they may not have restarted in-person worship again. But are there a couple principles from the book that you think could be helpful to any church given this moment of restarting public worship, restarting programming, restarting mission in their context?
That's a terrifically insightful question.
Well, I'm terrifically insightful, Gordon.
I know you are. And so yes, I think there are some things that are absolutely crucial. One, most churches are stuck. And I hear repeatedly people saying, well, let's just go back to the way we were. Well, the way we were is why we're stuck. So why would we want to go back and do the same things all over again? Why don't we use this as an opportunity to introduce change? And another thing that's a key about any kind of pastor that's going to do revitalization or a restart is they have to introduce change and be able to lead change. And change makes people uncomfortable. Change creates conflict. But during this time, don't go back to what you were. Sit down and use this time as that closure time to refocus, to retool, to rethink, to replan, to revision, and then launch with a new vigor. And it's going to be interesting to see what the church looks like after this. Some people will not come back at all. Other people are saying, it's kind of fun to watch church on Sunday morning in my pajamas, whatever. But now is the time to really begin to rethink. And if we've been stuck, why do we want to go back so we can get stuck again? Someone put it this way: the only difference between a grave and a rut is length.
Oh, the only difference between a grave and a rut is length. That's a good word.
Yeah. So now would be the time to say, Lord, we've been soft on the Great Commission. We've not done a good job of reaching the neighborhood. People have been connecting online. So, Lord, how can we use this time? I look at this time as not a terrible disaster. I think God is using this time to develop in people a sense of the need for the Lord Jesus Christ, a sense, Ecclesiastes 3:11, God has placed eternity on our hearts. So for young people for a long time weren't thinking about death and dying. Well, they are now. And people have been settled in. But if you think about it, God has dealt with a lot of the idols in American society. Sports, wealth.
Yep. Kids' activities.
Oh, yeah. Independence.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you can go on down the list. And so I think what's happening is there's an unsettledness. And when there's unsettledness, people tend to be more open to the gospel.
Yeah.
One of my friends, for example, works out at a gym regularly. He can't do that anymore. And he has 3 really good friends there who are lost. So he called them up and he said, listen, would you guys like to do a Bible study with me? So they're going through the gospel online every week, and they're doing the assignments. They're working, and God's word is working into their lives. So there's going to be some new birth coming out of this. So as churches, we need to think, how can we be better at the things that Christ has called us to do? And let's forget the stuff that was so important in the past that's really not important. God has swept away a lot of the traditions and traditionalism that has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, has nothing to do with the power of the gospel. It has everything to do with the comfort of the saints.
Yeah.
And so let's get back on mission and use this time to do that.
Yeah. I think that's a good place as any to wrap up that word of let's get back on mission with Jesus. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us today. The book is Restart Churches. It's available through Church Smart Resources. You can find it on Amazon. Gordon, if our listeners want to reach out to you and access your other materials and your coaching and your training, where can they find you?
If they want, they can go to turnaroundpastor.com. They can email me at gordon@turnaroundpastor.com, or they can use my personal email. And I know this is dangerous to put it out there. Let's just leave it at gordon@turnaroundpastor.com.
That's good. You just put that out there. Excellent. Gordon Penfold is the immediate past president of the Great Commission Research Network. He runs Turnaround Pastors. He's a decades-long minister himself, and his new book is Restart Churches. Thank you, Gordon, for being on the show, and thank you all for listening. This has been an episode of the Church Renewal Podcast. The Church Renewal Podcast is a ministry of Flourish Coaching. When pastors and churches feel stuck, a Flourish coach comes alongside them to renew their hope in the gospel and help them clarify their strategy. You can find Flourish at flourishcoaching.org or on Facebook, Flourish Coaching, or at facebook.com/Flourish Coaching and the number 1, Flourish Coaching 1 on Facebook. You can reach me. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, Director of Ops at Flourish Coaching. I'm Alan, ALLAN, at flourishcoaching.org. You know, there's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and that is that Jesus is yet gathering a people to himself, and the ordinary way he does that is through the ministry of the local church. So join us next time as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.